Hi everyone, this is Professor Hall, and today we are going to be talking about adding evidence to your essay. This is part 1, summaries and paraphrases. So part 2 is actually talking about quotations and how to add quotations, but quotations kind of have their own unique issues, and I wanted to talk a little bit first about how to summarize, how to paraphrase, and how to incorporate those into an essay. So first up, InText Citations. What are InText Citations? Well, it sounds kind of complicated, but it's really not. If you think about it, these are the citations that occur when you cite the sources that you use in the text of your paper. Sometimes these are also called parentheticals, because they occur in parentheses like that. So a couple teachers you have might call them parentheticals. I like to just call them in-text citations. They're different from the citations that come in the works cited page, which you're not going to be doing for this week. You're not going to have a works cited page until next week. And there's other videos about how to do that, but we'll just talk about the in-text citations today, the things in the text of your paper. So you need to include citations after you have a summary, a paraphrase, or a quotation. Really, anytime you have information, ideas, or words that are from another source. So anything that's not your own words, not your own ideas, not your own information. An in-text citation includes two things: the author's last name and the page number. If there are no pages, I want you to use a paragraph number. So if you have a source that's from online, this is something that is actually called, you might hear other people talk about this in other classes, but unpaginated or non-paginated. It's just a fancy word for saying un means not, page meaning page numbers. So same thing, no page numbers, then you should use a paragraph number. Now, a lot of people won't have you do this. If you don't have pages, they'll just have you use the author's last name. The reason that I want you to do the paragraph numbers is for two reasons. First, what we're doing is MLA citation. MLA citation stands for Modern Language Association, but there are other citation formats that do require you to have paragraph numbers. So just in case you use some of those other ones, I want you to kind of get used to it. The second reason is that I want to be able to go into your research and find your quotation or your paraphrase or your summary. And it's really hard for me to do that if you have a website that's unpaginated, has no page numbers. Let's say it's, 30 paragraphs long. If I don't know where it is, it's going to take me quite a long time. So for me to double check your research, I need to have that in there. So what do in-text citations look like? Here is one example. Here we have the author's name, James Farthington believes that girls should be allowed in Boy Scouts, and then we have the paragraph where it occurs. Because I have the author's name here, this is one thing that I need in the citation, I don't need to have it here. So here I can just have that page number. Oops. I will go to my little eraser so you can see this better. Sorry. So I just have the page number because the author's name is used in a sentence. The article had no page numbers, so I used PAR period to show it was a paragraph from the article. Example 2. The author believes that girls should not be allowed in the Boy Scouts. This is from someone who has the last name of Monroe, and it was on the first page of his article. So since the author's name is not used in the sentence, I have included it at the end in the citation. Monroe and then 1. You notice in both places the period comes after the citation, so you're kind of treating it like it's part of the sentence. One of the other things I don't have here, but somebody asked me the last time I did this, and I forgot to put it in. If you have an organization that's the author. Like, let's say that your organization is the Boy Scouts of America. Then you can put it in parentheses and you can use their abbreviation. They're known as the BSA. And then wherever that information was from. Let's say it's from a page on their website and it's in their second paragraph on that page. It would look kind of like that. Another one, let's say you're using the Red Cross and that's the organization. I don't want an abbreviation there. Red Cross, and let's say that's in a book that they put out and that's on page 4, right? That's sort of how it would look. So author's last name or the organization title. If you have a source that does not have an author at all, not even an organization, you really shouldn't be using it because it's just not going to be trustworthy. So your paragraph should include these things, and I talked about this last time in the rhetorical analysis example. First, you make your point, you give your evidence, you have an explanation or analysis for that evidence, and then you link, or sometimes this is called a transition, to your next point. You need to have this in your paragraphs. So today we're going to talk about how to add this part, how to add that evidence to a paragraph when you're writing it. A lot of times people call this the evidence sandwich. So you introduce the evidence, you give the evidence, you cite the evidence, and then you explain the evidence. And one of the biggest things here to keep in mind is balance. I want you to make sure that you have a balance between giving the evidence, there we go, and explaining the evidence. Think of this like a sandwich. You can think of like, for the most part, I don't want to go and have a hamburger that has like 10 patties in the middle where I can't even control it or get my mouth around the burger, right? I don't want so much evidence there in a paper that it's just kind of strung together and there's nothing holding those pieces of information together. Similarly, I don't want so much explanation and no meat. If I get a sandwich, I'm sorry if I'm offending any vegetarians, by the way, but if I get a sandwich that's just bread and maybe a piece of cheese, that's not really going to be helpful. So I really need to have both of those items together. And we're going to talk about the evidence today in the form of, there we go. For this class, evidence comes from sources. And I have this little graphic that I'm going to play again. Because you need to filter the information from an article and give from that article your main ideas and your supporting points. Now, if you have a shorter article that you're writing, having just maybe a couple main ideas for your essay, that might work. If you have a longer essay that you're writing, you might need more supporting points, but you don't want so many details that they're really not relevant to whatever point you're making, right? The other thing too to remember is that for some of your papers, you're writing things where I've given you the research. For other papers, I have over 100 students in college composition. So I have you guys do things called annotated bibliographies, which there's other videos about that later. But I have you do that to show me what sources you're using and what you're going to use from those sources. But for my purposes, I look at your research. I don't read every single word of every single article that every single student gives me. So I really need you to give the main points and the supporting details, the important facts, the important examples, so that I can understand the research and know what the important things are that you want me to remember. There's main 3 types of evidence from sources, or 3 ways to use evidence from sources. You can give examples or a fact or an opinion, but usually you give those in the form of summary, a paraphrase, or a direct quotation. And as I said before, we're going to look at 1 and 2 right now. So giving the evidence, type 1, the summary. There's our filter again. With a summary, you take a large portion of text and you shorten it so that only the main points remain. We're going to look at some examples of this in a minute. Once you understand the main points, set the original material aside. What do I mean by this? Well, sometimes for an internet source, what I do is I kind of flip, keep the browser open, but I change tabs or I minimize a window wherever my information is, right? For a printed out source, I'll turn it over, but I'll keep the book near me so I can refer back to it. The reason that I tell people this is because it keeps you from using the author's original language. Now, if you watched the video on plagiarism, you know that using the author's original language and not actually quoting them is a type of plagiarism, even if you cite it. You have to have things in your own words, and that is really the key to writing a summary. You're going to rewrite the main points, but you're going to do so using your own words. Now, we still cite it because it's not your idea. It's the author's idea. So tips for writing a summary. If you are looking at a smaller piece of text like a paragraph, you can ask, what is the topic of the paragraph? If you have a longer thing, you can look at what is the topic of each paragraph of this article. Sometimes teachers talk about a summary being like, or a paragraph being like a hand. So there's a main idea and all the other things are kind of connected to that main idea. Look at the topic sentences. Look at some of the supporting details. What's the author trying to argue or explain about the topic? I need to know that from you if you're writing a summary. What do you find the most interesting about a paragraph in an essay, or an entire essay, or an entire article? What's the most important thing from each paragraph that your reader will need to know? If you keep in mind those things, particularly this, what's the most interesting and what's the most important? What's the author's overall argument and the topic? Really, that's the key. Take those things, distill it, boil it, condense it down, whatever word you want to use, and then you put those in your summary in your own words. So, when looking for main ideas, sometimes you'll be writing not for this class, but for other classes. You might write where your textbook is a piece of information. Look for ideas or words that are repeated or things in italics or boldface. A lot of times those are what an author wants you to remember. If you are doing stuff for this class and you're doing research online, look for things that have been hyperlinked. A lot of times things that are hyperlinked means that you can click on it online and it goes to another article about the same subject. Sometimes when things are hyperlinked, they just lead to ads. But if you're in a real publication that's reputable, they'll have things that are hyperlinked that are important things from that article, and they'll link to other articles about the same subject, which is also a nice tip for when you're doing research. The first and last sentences of each paragraph. A lot of times the author will put the topic sentence or the main idea of the paragraph in the first or last sentence. You can also look at the first and last paragraphs of an essay. So if you look at an author's introduction, I don't know what happened with the pen there, and conclusion, you can a lot of times find what their main points are. A lot of times they'll have their claim or their thesis in the introduction. They'll summarize everything they had to say in their conclusion. This is a good study tip as well. If you're reading and trying to write notes that are summarizing everything you're reading, just look at the first and last paragraphs, because a lot of times that's where the main ideas are. So the main idea shows the author's opinion, argument, or explanation of the topic. There may be supporting details as well. So think about what's the most important supporting detail, and what's the most interesting, and what best helps to reinforce the main idea. That's what you want to keep in your summary. Here's our summary example. So these are from a couple years ago. New York City had a ban on certain size of soft drinks. That picture is showing you how much sugar is in each size of soft drink. So this is the entire first paragraph of this guy's essay. It's Ron Rosenbaum's Let Them Eat is the title. And I kind of will say, sorry, I flipped a little bit too quickly there. I will say this. I picked this example because his main idea is not clear. So it's not like I can just take the first sentence and quote him, right? So let's see what he has to say. The hysterical crusade against fat has become a veritable witch hunt, with New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg's ban on supersized sodas, now temporarily thwarted, and the First Lady's campaign to push leaves and twigs, i.e. salad, on reluctant school children, all in the name of stamping out obesity. It is fat-shaming time in America. Yes, there are counter-trends like pro-fat TV shows of Paula Deen and Guy Fieri, but in the culture at large, eating that kind of fat has become class-based badge of shame. Redneck food isn't food for someone who drives a Prius to Pilates class. So one of the things here, we talked about rhetoric, right? You can see his loaded words here. Hysterical crusade, leaves and twigs, stamping out, redneck, Prius, and Pilates. These are things that really show that he has a very sarcastic and kind of bitter tone. And I forgot to hear fat shaming time. But what's his main point? What is he exactly trying to say? Well, I wanted to write a summary of this. So I went and I looked for words that actually found the main idea. So I have the mayor. He had a ban on supersized sodas. The First Lady had a campaign to push salad, all in the name of stamping out obesity, but it was fat shaming time in America. And there were counter trends. And then this I highlighted in blue is kind of his main point. In the culture at large, eating that kind of fat is a class-based badge of shame. What he's trying to say, I think, is that there are people who can afford to eat well, and there are people who cannot afford to eat well. And so people who cannot afford to eat well have this kind of badge of shame, like, oh, I like ribs, I like soda, I like pizza, I like beer. Whereas people who have money will say things like, oh, I had the most delightful endive salad with raspberries and cranberries on it the other day with fresh goat cheese, right? It's a little bit of a class difference. That's sort of what he's getting at. So how do I boil this down and rewrite it? Well, here's the paragraph with my highlights. Here are the main points from his essay as a whole. I just think that some of this is in the first paragraph, but this was from the entire article. Number one, because of the obesity epidemic, politicians are waging campaigns to encourage people to be healthier. You can see that where he has the thing about Mayor Bloomberg and the former First Lady. So that's kind of the first point there, rewritten. Two, these political campaigns are fat-shaming people. Three, some people are pushing against fat-shaming trends. That's where he said the counter trends there. And four, there's an overall trend in our culture to believe that eating fatty food is only for the poor, while eating healthy food is for the upper class. Those are his four main points that are in his entire article, if you were to read it. And they're in this first paragraph too. But it kind of took some coaxing out there a little bit to get to those main points. So here's my summary paragraph. In his article, Let Them Eat, Ron Rosenbaum explains that because of the obesity epidemic, politicians are waging campaigns to encourage people to be healthier. Now you will notice here for my sandwich, I introduced my evidence. I have the article title, and I have the author's full name. Okay? Then it comes to my summary. He believes these political campaigns are a way of fat-shaming people. This sums up the entire article in two sentences and shows the author's main point without using his original words. I introduce the article and I tell you what it's about. 2 sentences. Politicians are waging campaigns. He, the author, believes that these political campaigns fat shame people. The other thing that you can kind of notice here is that the summary does not show my opinion on the subject. I'm not telling you whether I agree with Ron Rosenbaum or I don't agree with Ron Rosenbaum. All I'm telling you is, hey, this is what his article is about. Okay, so I'm going to show you another example here just very briefly. This is from a different article by Gina Belafonte. Now she says, last fall, Mayor Bloomberg said 6,000 New Yorkers died from obesity. Obesity and its related illnesses, as we know, disproportionately affect low-income communities. Then she talks for a couple sentences about how they affect low-income communities, but that's not really her main point. She finishes with, it is recognition of poverty itself as a public health problem. So her main idea in her article here, as I've rewritten it, Gina Belafonte's article, In the Obesity Epidemic, Poverty is an Ignored Contingent, explains that politicians are not just fighting childhood obesity and related illnesses. They are fighting against one of the causes of childhood obesity, poverty. This summarizes, again, 2 sentences. You can see that I have the author's name. You can see that I have the title. And then I have my short summary, giving you in 1 sentence what her entire article was about. So a summary is a little bit different from a paraphrase. With a summary, you're taking a very large portion of text. I used the paragraphs back there just as brief examples, but really the summaries that I gave were from the entire article. Both of those articles were about 4 or 5 pages long. A paraphrase is a little bit different. A paraphrase is taken from a short piece of text, such as a sentence, sometimes 2 sentences, but it's basically a shorter piece of text. You look at the original material, pick out an important sentence that contains the main idea of the author's work. Then you rewrite the sentence, again, using your own words. You can use a thesaurus to help you. In Microsoft Word, you can get a thesaurus by highlighting the word and pressing Shift and F7. Sometimes, I will say that on my computer, I have a new computer, and Shift plus F7 puts my computer into airplane mode, so it doesn't really work for me. Another way you can do it is to right click on the word and the thesaurus will pop up for you. So that's your other option there. And if you don't know, a thesaurus is a book or an online tool that has synonyms or similar words for the word that you're looking for. If you have English as a second language, a thesaurus can be quite helpful sometimes. Even if you want to use it just to find out what a word means, a little bit more clear than a dictionary definition. Paraphrase example. So this is from Ron Rosenbaum's Let Them Eat. I'm going to flip over to my next slide because I've been going a little bit long here, and I'm going to speed this up for you guys. So finding the main idea. Here's his entire paragraph, and I have highlighted preventing obesity is a laudable goal, but it has become the rationale of indiscriminate fat hunters. It can shade into a type of bullying of the overweight. So I circled the word laudable because I like what Ron Rosenbaum has to say. I want to use what's highlighted in my essay, but I don't want to use his exact words. Maybe I had too many quotes already. For whatever reason, I just want to kind of reword it. So I'm going to write a paraphrase. Here's the original text, and then the thesaurus entries for laudable: praiseworthy, admirable, commendable, or brave. Now, we're going to talk about quoting, but I've taken out some words here in my square brackets, and now I have some thesaurus entries for laudable. I kind of like admirable. I think that's sort of what he's saying. Laudable basically means worthy of praise. To laud someone means to praise them. So here's my paraphrase. Trying to end the obesity epidemic is admirable, but some people use the fight against obesity as an excuse to bully people who are overweight. So you've noticed here that I use a few words that are similar. We have bullying and we have bully because that word can't really be changed. But instead of preventing, I have trying to end. Instead of indiscriminate fat hunters, I have some people who use the fight against obesity as an excuse instead of rationale. So you can see keeps exactly the same idea. And because it's the same idea, even though it's my own words, I still have to cite it. So I have Rosenbaum, and it's from the first page of his article. Here's another example of a paraphrase, a little bit more practice. Gina Belafonte's article, the poor are more likely to live with asthma, depression, gun violence, and pests. And then she talks about what the goal should be to help them. So the part that I highlighted was the articulated goal should not simply be to create a population of poor people who are thin, but to create a population of poor people who are less poor. Here's my paraphrase. Belafonte, now I've used her full name already, so here I just have her last name. That's important to know. You're not going to say Gina. One of my college professors said to me when I did that, the author is not your friend. You don't use their first name, you use their last name. You don't know them on a personal basis. So Belafonte explains that the aim of politicians shouldn't just be to help people diet, but to fight against poverty so that everyone in America is healthier. So here, instead of having thin, I have diet. Instead of having poor, I have poverty. But the idea is the exact same, and so I have the citation, Belafonte from page 2. Now you notice for my sandwich, I have introduced the evidence with Belafonte explains. I give the evidence in the form of my citation, and then I cite it. Now, if this were a real essay, I would go on to explain the evidence and give that second part of that hamburger bun. So, just to remember, your paragraph should include making your point, giving your evidence, explaining it, and then linking it to your next point. That sandwich part is used for the evidence and for the explanation a little bit. You need to introduce it, you need to give it, you need to cite it, and then you need to explain it. And you should always have those parts in your paper. So, putting it all together, here is the point of my full Peel paragraph. The childhood obesity epidemic is often discussed by politicians, but often the goal of politicians is just to make the population thinner. Belafonte explains that the aim of politicians shouldn't be to just help people diet, but to fight against poverty so that everyone in America is healthier. Belafonte is correct. Politicians should not try to simply make people thinner. They should attack the leading causes of obesity instead. Helping people overcome poverty is the number one thing politicians can do to prevent obesity-related illnesses. People in poverty cannot afford proper health care, nutritional counseling, gym memberships, personal trainers, or healthy foods such as fruits or vegetables. And then our link to our next point. While politicians claim to want to end obesity, they also support lobbyists from unhealthy fast food and junk food corporations to keep unhealthy foods cheap and affordable from people in poverty. So if you were reading this, you would know the main point here is to argue that politicians are often just trying to make the population less obese. They think by making them less obese, that will take care of some of the illnesses, and then they won't have to spend as much government money on treating those illnesses, right? I have my evidence countering the politician's goal and explaining what their aim should be. Then I have my explanation, and then my link to my next point. Sometimes, again, this is called a transition. Okay? What you will notice is that we have that 1-to-3 ratio. How many lines here do I have for this quotation? 3. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So here I have 3 lines of a paraphrase, 3 lines from my source, and 11 lines from my own writing, which almost keeps this 1-to-3 ratio almost exactly. And that's about what I expect from your papers. I don't want you to have just a bunch of your explanation without any I'm going to erase all the ink on the slide for a minute. I don't want anything that just has a bunch of your explanation with no evidence, but I also don't want just evidence kind of strung together. The next paragraph talks about the cost of whole foods. So one of the things that I'd like you to note especially is with these links in the sample papers that I've given you, how do people transition? Do their transitions make sense? Are they logical? Now here, I have talked about politicians wanting to end obesity, which I just talked about. And then next, I have how they support lobbyists. So I've brought up the point that I just had, and I bring up my second point that I'm going to talk about here, which is a good logical transition. So remember, I want you to have a balance between your words and the author's words, a 1-to-3 ratio. For every one line of summary or paraphrase or quotation, you should have 3 lines of your own words to explain, to analyze, to introduce, all of that. You need to interpret the evidence. This is the most important thing. You have to analyze and explain. You can't just have a paper with a bunch of quotes strung together. You can also not have a paper with no evidence. You really have to think about the balance here. The only time you don't need a 1-to-3 ratio is when you have a summary paragraph. Now, for some of your essays and some of your journal entries too, I'll say, hey, I gave you a reading, write me a 1 summary paragraph showing you read it and you understood it. When you have a summary paragraph, you don't have to have an explanation. But again, it should only be 1 paragraph. You should not be summarizing evidence for an entire paper. So that is it. And please take the time after this to watch the second video about how to use quotations.